How much is a human life worth? If you ask a philosopher, they'll say it's priceless. If you ask a doctor, they might point to the miracle of biology. But if you ask the Ford Motor Company in the early 1970s, they had a very specific number for you. To be precise, it was $200,000. Imagine you're driving home on a clear evening. You're in a compact, stylish car that promised to light up your life. You're doing everything right. You're staying in your lane, keeping a safe distance, and following the speed limit. But then a minor mistake happens. Someone taps your rear bumper at 25 miles per hour. In any other car, this is a fender bender, an insurance headache, a trip to the body shop. But in your Ford Pinto, it's a death sentence. The fuel tank sits just inches behind the rear axle. There's no structural protection. Upon impact, the tank is pushed forward into the differential. Bolts. They puncture the metal like a spear. Gasoline sprays everywhere. Within seconds, the cabin is an oven. And as you struggle with a door that has jammed shut due to the frame buckling, you realize the horrifying truth. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculation. This is the story of the Ford Pinto. It is perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of American industry. It's not just a story about a bad car or a mechanical failure. It is a story about the cold, the calculated logic of corporate greed. It's about what happens when the bottom line becomes more important than human breath. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the late 1960s. The American auto industry was at a crossroads. For decades, Detroit had been the king of the world. Big engines, chrome fins, and massive steel frames were the standard. But the tide was turning. Small, fuel-efficient cars from Japan and Europe were flooding the market. Companies like Volkswagen and Toyota were eating Ford's lunch. Lee Iacocca, the legendary executive who had already brought the world the Mustang, knew he had to strike back. He wanted a car that weighed less than 2,000 pounds and cost less than $2,000. He called it the 2000 by 2000 rule. It was a project born of desperation and intense competition. Usually, developing a new car took about 43 months. Iacocca demanded the Pinto be ready in 25. When you rush engineering, you cut corners. It's inevitable. During the development phase, Ford's engineers conducted crash tests. They discovered a terrifying flaw. In almost every rear-end collision test over 20 miles per hour, the fuel tank ruptured. The design was fundamentally broken. The tank was placed in a crush zone without enough protection. Now, in a normal world, this is where the engineers go back to the drawing board. They move the tank, they add a steel plate, they fix the problem, and Ford's engineers actually knew exactly how to fix it. They had several options. They could have installed a plastic baffle to protect the tank from the bolts, cost $1 per car. They could have moved the tank above the axle, cost a bit more in labor, or they could have added a rubber bladder inside the tank to prevent leaks, cost $11. But Ford didn't do any of those things. Instead, they did something that would eventually haunt the legal system for decades. They sat down and performed a cost-benefit analysis. This document, which later became known as the Pinto Memo, is one of the most chilling pieces of paper ever produced by a corporation. Ford executives looked at the data. They estimated that the defect would result in 180 burn deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and 2,100 burn vehicles per year. Then, they assigned a dollar value to those lives. Using government data, they decided a death was worth $200,000. A serious injury was worth $67,000. They crunched the numbers. Fixing the cars would cost them $137 million. Paying out the lawsuits for the deaths and injuries, that would only cost about $49 million. The math was simple. It was $88 million cheaper to let people burn. Think about that for a second. Somewhere in a boardroom in Dearborn, Michigan, people in suits looked at a spreadsheet. On one side was a small repair cost. On the other side were human screams. They chose the spreadsheet. They decided that the occasional funeral was just a cost of doing business. So, the Pinto went to market. It was a hit. It was cheap. It looked decent, and it was exactly what the public wanted during the fuel crisis. But soon the reports started coming in. People weren't just dying in high-speed wrecks, they were dying in parking lots. They were dying while stopped at red lights. One of the most famous cases involved a woman named Lily Gray and a teenager named Richard Grimshaw. They were driving on a California highway when their Pinto stalled. They were hit from behind at a relatively low speed. The car erupted. Lily Gray died from her injuries. Richard Grimshaw survived, but he spent the rest of his life undergoing dozens of surgeries to repair the devastating burns over most of his body. During the trial, the truth started to leak out. It wasn't just that the car was dangerous. It was that Ford knew. The jury was so horrified by the Pinto Memo and the blatant disregard for life that they awarded Grimshaw $125 million in punitive damages. At the time, it was the largest payout in history. The judge eventually reduced it, but the message was sent. Ford tried to fight back. They claimed that the Pinto was no more dangerous than other subcompacts of the era. They argued that every car has risks, but the public wasn't buying it. The image of the barbecue that seats four became as etched into the American psyche. The Pinto scandal changed everything. It led to the first time a corporation was ever charged with homicide. In 1980, the state of Indiana took Ford to court for the deaths of 3 young women who died when their Pinto exploded. Ford was eventually acquitted in that specific criminal case, but the damage was done. The era of corporate calculated risk, where human life was a variable in an equation, was officially under scrutiny. The irony is that Ford eventually had to recall the Pinto anyway. The very repairs they refused to do because of the cost were forced upon them by the government and public pressure. They ended up paying far more in legal fees, settlements, and lost reputation than the $11 per car it would have cost to save those lives in the first place. This story serves as a grim reminder of what happens when a company loses its moral compass in pursuit of a deadline and a budget. It reminds us that behind every efficient business decision, there are real people with families, dreams, and futures. Ford didn't set out to kill people. They set out to beat Volkswagen. But in their race to the top of the sales charts, they forgot that a car is more than just a product. It's a responsibility. The engineering department was essentially silenced by the marketing and accounting departments. In the corporate structure of the early 70s, Iacocca's word was law. If he said the car had to be under 2,000 pounds, engineers couldn't just add 20 pounds of steel reinforcement to the rear. If they did, they'd be over budget and overweight in the eyes of management. That was a bigger failure than a safety risk that might only affect a small percentage of users. This is the psychological trap of big business. When you're looking at numbers on a page, the humanity disappears. You don't see a mother of 3 or a college student with their whole life ahead of them. You see a unit, you see a probability, you see a liability. The Pinto became a symbol of everything wrong with American capitalism at the time. It wasn't just about the car, it was about the lack of accountability. For years, Ford insisted they did nothing wrong. They maintained that the car met all federal safety standards of the time, and technically, they were right. The standards for rear-end collisions were incredibly low back then. But there's a difference between what is legal and what is right. Ford operated in the gap between those two things. They knew the standards were weak, and they used that weakness to save money, knowing full well that people would pay for it with their lives. When the recall finally happened in 1978, Ford mailed out notices to owners. But even then, the process was slow. Some people didn't get their notices for months. Others didn't understand the severity of the situation. The fix was simple: a plastic shield and a new long-neck fuel filler pipe. It took less than an hour to install. An hour of labor and a few dollars in parts was all that stood between life and death for hundreds of people. The legacy of the Pinto lives on in every safety regulation we have today. It's why we have independent crash testing. It's why internal corporate memos are discoverable in court. It's why we no longer just take a company's word for it when they say a product is safe. But the temptation to prioritize profit over safety hasn't gone away. We see it in the pharmaceutical industry, in the tech world, and still in the auto industry. The Pinto wasn't an isolated incident of evil. It was a symptom of a system that rewards short-term gains over long-term ethics. In the end, Lee Iacocca went on to become one of the most celebrated businessmen in history. He saved Chrysler from bankruptcy and became a national hero. The Pinto was a blemish on his record, but it didn't stop his ascent. The corporation survived. The executives kept their bonuses, but for the families of those who burned inside their own cars, there was no comeback. There was no restructuring. The story of the Ford Pinto teaches us that we have to be vigilant. We have to move past the shiny paint and the clever marketing. We have to demand that the companies we buy from value our lives more than their quarterly reports. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that if we don't set the price of our own lives, someone else will do it for us. And their price might be lower than you think. It might be as low as $11, or it might be as low as $200,000. But whatever the number is, it will always be a calculation. And in that calculation, if you aren't the one holding the pen, you are just another variable. The silence in the aftermath of the Pinto scandal was deafening. While the lawsuits piled up, the culture within Detroit began to shift, albeit slowly. Engineers started to gain more leverage, and safety became a selling point rather than a burden. The rise of Volvo and their focus on safety forced the American giants to realize that the public actually cared about surviving a crash. However, the scars remained. The Pinto case is still taught in business schools today as a primary example of unethical behavior. It serves as the ultimate cautionary tale. When you remove the human element from a decision, you aren't just making a mistake, you are committing a crime against the very people you serve. The next time you see a massive corporate recall or hear about a company cutting corners on safety, remember the Pinto. Remember the $200,000 price tag they put on a human soul. Remember the smoke, the fire, and the jammed doors, and ask yourself, what is the true cost of a bargain? Is it worth the $11 they saved? Think about the families who had to receive that settlement check. Imagine being told by a court that your child's life was worth exactly what a mid-level executive decided it was worth 5 years before the accident even happened. It's a level of coldness that is hard to wrap your head around. It's the ultimate expression of corporate psychopathy. What do you think? Was this just a case of standard business practice gone wrong, or should executives have faced prison time for the Pinto Memo? Should the people who signed off on that calculation be held personally responsible for the deaths they predicted? It's a question that still haunts the halls of justice and corporate headquarters alike. Let me know in the comments below.